The world is heating up. There are a bunch of interconnected operations involving the oil trade right now. They involve actors on 5 continents, so I think it is fair to describe this as a world oil war, even if this is, thankfully, not a world war in the classic sense. Half of what I am referring to is the US seizure of an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela. Indeed, you are watching footage of the actual seizure right now. This made major international headlines, so you are probably already familiar with it in a broad sense, though there is a lot of misinformation on social media about the rationale and the political implications that we will have to sort through later today. The other half is a new strategy that Ukraine has started, which has flown under the radar and will likely have a more consequential effect on the war than anything else happening right now, including at Pokrovsk or Kupiansk, or bold Zelensky appearances therein. I suppose it is understandable when the strike map overall looks like this. A few extra X's does not seem like they should matter. But Ukraine is doing something fundamentally different than it has before, which says something about what is happening with the broader domestic situation inside of Russia. And while I do not have any reason to believe that these actions are coordinated, they do have complicated knock-on effects with one another that are worth sorting through. So today, let's discuss what is happening on each of these fronts and how they ultimately come together. And I want to begin with Ukraine, because that campaign will be more familiar. Plus, it has a jolting moment that will make you go, wait, they can do that? As a preface, let's cover the basic logic of Ukraine's energy campaign, while those of you who are not walking your dogs catch up on the timeline. Up until recently, the oil portion of this campaign focused on refineries. This is for a few reasons. 1, they are higher up on the value chain. If you destroy the refinery and the oil sitting there with it, then all of the investment lower down on the value chain also effectively evaporates. So if you could only target one category, it should be the refineries. 2, refineries come with their own explosive capacity. If your drones cannot cause much damage on their own, you can instead point them to liquids that are practically begging to explode. And 3, it was unclear whether Russia's shadow fleet had any spare capacity at the start of this. If the answer was no, then Russia would be unable to reroute its spare crude. You see, if a refinery is offline, the crude oil that would normally go to it has to go elsewhere. But if there were no excess tankers available, then the crude would essentially have to sit in Russia, earning absolutely no value. So, if you were limited in the quantity of your long-range strike packages and the explosive power therein, the refinery strategy was a sensible option. And that was a fair summary of Ukraine's strategy for about 3 months. But something new started to happen toward the end of November. This was easy to miss given that everyone's attention was otherwise focused on ceasefire negotiations, and those of us stateside were busy eating unpardoned turkeys. I am referring to Ukraine's new campaign to target oil shipments. It is something that I might have missed out if not for the sponsor of today's video, Ground News. Recently, I have found their daily briefing to be especially helpful. A handful of each day's most important or interesting stories, with convenient summaries that go beyond just the headlines. More information about Trump trying to break apart the European Union's powerful trade bloc, the latest summary of those ceasefire negotiations, and Secretary General Mark Rutte warning of a Russian attack in 5 years. Please remember that timeline because we will revisit it in a future video. I get all of this with my Ground News Vantage plan, and by going to ground.news/linesonmaps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can get 40% off your subscription today. So thanks again to Ground News for their continued support of this channel. Let's dig into that new wave of attacks. I am referring to these X's here. They are not targeting Russia's internal petrol production. They are targeting exports. Technically, the first of these occurred on August 24th. We could dismiss that attack as a bit of a one-off. The next strikes in this vein occurred on October 6th and 13th, both on the Crimean Peninsula. But it is easy to look past these two, because the target doubled as an important fueling facility for the Russian army. November is where the evidence became clear. 3 more strikes on export terminals along the Black Sea, in addition to a bonus strike on that aforementioned Crimean facility. Then 2 strikes on oil tankers floating on the Black Sea on November 29th, another one on December 10th, and then Ukraine struck an oil rig on December 11th. Plus there was that Senegal jump scare. Ukraine has officially denied playing a role there, but reports citing internal Ukrainian sources say otherwise. For actual analysis, let's first chat about Ukraine's martial capacity here, before pivoting to the more complicated economics. It is not surprising that Ukraine could use sea-based drones to destroy oil tankers. Ukraine has basically canceled out the Black Sea naval fleet, and it is not like oil tankers are better defended than military vessels. The bigger issues were market slack and politics. Remember, Ukraine's refinery campaign hoped that there was no slack in the shadow fleet, so when Russia started to have excess oil piling up, there was no physical means to export it. Presumably, observing how Russia has reacted to the strikes has told Ukraine that there is indeed no such slack. Thus, if you destroy a tanker, there will not simply be a new one to replace it, and thus they are worth striking. The other half is political. A good part of the fleet is not Russian-owned, or at least has ownership interests outside of Russia. If Ukraine struck them, it risked some political wrath falling back Kyiv's way. Well, I guess we now know where Ukraine and Zelensky have come down on that one. In terms of a fully effective campaign, though, we still have to wonder about Ukraine's ability to project power. It is one thing to destroy tankers along the Black Sea. It is another thing to do it elsewhere, like, say, along the Baltic, where a majority of Russia's oil exports originate from. Or, if not the Baltic, then wherever those tankers ultimately end up. Going back to 2022, we had suggestive evidence of Ukraine's ability to conduct special forces operations out there. Western intelligence believes that Ukraine was responsible for the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. But sea drones destroying tankers would require more sustained operations. Well, perhaps the Senegal situation, if it did have Ukraine's fingerprints on it, provides some suggestive answers. Somehow, Ukraine may have the ability to produce its sea drones internationally, or at least it has the ability to smuggle them out of Ukraine. Indeed, the owner of the tanker struck outside of Senegal is calling it quits. No more Russian oil. It does not want its other tankers to have to deal with that mess. And maybe that was a good call. The reporting on this is ambiguous and sometimes conflicting, but it may have been sea drones that damaged the Caspian oil rig, not UAVs flying all the way from Ukraine. And even if it was UAVs, Ukraine followed that strike by hitting 2 ships transporting weapons within the Caspian. Those were sea drones, so Ukraine definitely can do this, allegedly in conjunction with some unnamed resistance groups in one of the Caspian countries. On the economic side of things, it is worth pointing out that there is almost certainly some redundancy in these strikes. Proper exporting has 3 components: the crude itself, the terminal capacity to push the crude to sea, and the tankers to carry the crude to a buyer. If the refinery campaign is as successful as it seems, Russia should already have more oil than it knows what to do with. In turn, hitting the Caspian oil rig may not have much of an effect on Russian revenues. It will still be expensive to repair, but it is not quite hitting the Kremlin's checkbook in a way designed to reduce war production. The terminals and the shadow fleet are where the weak links are. However, removing a segment of each of these is redundant. If you lose a portion of your terminal capacity, it renders the equivalent portion of the shadow fleet irrelevant. Tankers do not matter if there is no ability to load them. Likewise, if you lose a portion of your tanker capacity, it renders the equivalent portion of your terminals irrelevant. Terminals do not matter if there is no tanker to accept the crude. There is some complication there because the shadow fleet operates on an international market. We will get back to that when we discuss the United States and Venezuela, but the general point still holds. Thus, the best that I can make of what Ukraine's strategy is here is that the planners in Kyiv are just unsure of what works. So they are trying a little bit of everything. Maybe once they learn what works better, we might start seeing a more focused strategy a couple of months from now. This seems like a good moment to flip over to the second half of the video, where we will now try to sort out what is happening in Venezuela. As I am sure that you are aware, a US fleet has been loitering in the area for months now. But a new twist came on December 10th. A mission consisting of 2 helicopters and roughly 30 service members from the Marines, Coast Guard, and Special Forces launched from the USS Gerald R. Ford and flew over to the Skipper, an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela. The United States apparently seized it without much of an issue. What happened next in the public sphere was predictable. The headlines say, "The United States seizes an oil tanker," and you know exactly which previous president everyone is going to start thinking about. But let's walk through a few subtle but important points here with some completely made-up Q&A. Question 1. The United States has been blowing up alleged Venezuelan drug boats for months now. But this time, the United States seized the oil tanker. Doesn't this prove that Trump is in this for the oil? Answer. We know what happens when you blow up oil tankers. They start leaking oil. No one wants that. Whether you were in this for the oil or not, there is no circumstance where you would want to start firing explosives at a tanker. I am sure that this is raising questions about what Ukraine is doing, but simultaneously, I am sure that Kyiv is past the point of caring. Note also that it seems that Ukraine has been disabling the tankers rather than blowing them up, so there have not been any associated environmental catastrophes yet. Question 2. What possible legal basis could Trump have for capturing the tanker? Answer. Well, actually, it is Biden's legal rationale. This is just the enforcement of a sanction placed on the Skipper after it was used to transport contraband between Iran and Hezbollah. That at least gives Trump the domestic authority to do so. As for the authority in international law, I doubt Trump cares much. There is a segment of his America First faction that interprets the phrase as America unilaterally. If the United States wants to and can seize the tanker, then it will. Period. But if Trump did care about international law, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea permits the seizure of stateless ships. The Skipper was flying a Guyanese flag, an interesting choice given that Maduro was threatening to invade Guyana a couple of years ago. It was also spoofing its location, pretending to be off Guyana's coast when it was really off Venezuela's. The key, though, is that Guyana has no association with it. That means the Skipper was flying a false flag. In turn, that makes it a stateless vessel, which is subject to seizure under the aforementioned United Nations Convention. Point is, there is a solid legal rationale behind this, especially in comparison to, say, the drug boat interdictions. Those, by comparison, have ignited legal furor both domestically and abroad. Question 3. Why won't Trump do this with Russian Shadow Fleet vessels? Answer. In broad strokes, the same reason Biden did not, and Europe, for the most part, presently does not. Escalation concerns with Moscow. In narrow strokes, Trump is unwilling to bear the costs that would actually force Russia to the bargaining table in a way acceptable to Europe, which is why he has been turning the screws so tightly on Ukraine. It is the only cheap option that has any chance of working. With working here meaning ending the war without much care about the substantive quality of the settlement. But to add some shades of gray to this answer, we do not quite know who owns the tanker. The last anyone does know, it was a Russian oligarch, and, for what it is worth, Russia has been fuming over the seizure since it happened. And to really turn the question on its head, the United States has tried stopping an explicit Russian vessel recently. The Seahorse, a ship, not the animal, was trying to enter Venezuela in November to deliver oil products that Venezuela needs for its own industry. 3 times, the USS Stockdale, currently seen on the screen, prevented it. On the 4th attempt, the Seahorse actually got through. Question 4. What will happen to the oil? Answer. According to Trump, the United States is going to take it. He actually said as much. And this is one of the big problems with Trump's presidency. He speaks off the cuff, and he has learned that it is generally good for him politically to do so. He has won 2 elections because he mobilized people to vote who do not ordinarily vote, or who have previously voted for Democrats. And they voted for him precisely because of his off-the-cuff style. But then it leads to him saying silly things when he has no idea what the actual answer is, rather than what a traditional politician would say when they do not know. It is a good question, and we will have to look into it before I can give you an answer. Anyway, as for the real answer, lawyers are going to have to look into it before anyone knows. That is what Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt had to say when asked about the whole exchange, because that is what is actually going to happen. The reason that no one can say now exactly who will get the spoils is because a bunch of people will make a claim for it. Anyone whom the Venezuelan government owes money to, for example. Certainly some representative from Venezuela's resistance will argue that proceeds should go into an interest-bearing account, with the funds to be distributed to the Venezuelan people once Maduro is gone from power. But that is ultimately something for a judge to decide. It is worth noting that it is a lot of money that we are talking about. Maduro says that the skipper was carrying about 2 million barrels of crude oil, with total value of about $84 million. This is about 2 full days of Venezuelan production. Question 5. Isn't this pushing us along the path of war? Answer. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that after seeing this happen, I am more convinced that Trump is serious about taking action in Venezuela. Thus, insofar as we are learning about whether Trump would intervene militarily, the skipper seizure should increase our expected probabilities. However, conditional on knowing Trump's sincerity, enforcing sanctions like this decreases the probability of military conflict. If Trump would invade if Maduro does not step down, then freezing Maduro's financial lifelines makes him more likely to step down, which means that Trump does not invade. In other words, if you think that sanctions are a substitute for war, then what we are seeing is indeed a substitute for war. It looks aggressive, yes, but sanctions are meaningless if you do not enforce them, and it is way better than jumping headfirst into an invasion. As a final section, we ought to discuss how the 2 fronts interact with one another. Earlier, I alluded to how the Shadow Fleet operates as an international marketplace, albeit one serving the likes of Russia, Venezuela, Iran, and others. In this framing, saying that there is no slack in the Shadow Fleet is really saying that the price that the Kremlin is willing to pay to hire another tanker is too expensive to be worthwhile. The immediate effect of the skipper seizure is to decrease the total supply of Shadow Fleet vessels. That increases Russia's costs of hiring a tanker, so there are positive externalities for Ukraine here. However, the long-run effects are more complicated. Reports vary, but there may be 8 to 30 more tankers near Venezuela that are under Iran or Russia-related sanctions. If their owners decide not to test the United States on this one, it will increase tanker supply from Russia's perspective. This is good news for the Kremlin. If Venezuela's oil can no longer make it to the global market, that is also good for the Kremlin. The gray market for crude cannot satiate willing buyers' demand. As a result, decreasing any supply of crude will increase all crude prices, with the gray market crude maintaining a discount compared to the open market. And indeed, crude prices ticked up after the operation. The Kremlin relies on high crude prices to fund the war effort, so this is also good news for the Kremlin there. However, it is important not to conflate good news for the Kremlin on these fronts as good news for the Kremlin overall. If Venezuela is de facto blockaded, then all of its trade with Russia has evaporated overnight. Venezuela was one of the few trading partners of consequence that Russia had left, so this is an awful economic sign for the Kremlin. That is why the reaction from Moscow was one of anger, even if there may be some fringe benefits for the Shadow Fleet. Still, this does inform Ukraine about what it should be doing with its infrastructure campaign. If Shadow Fleet tankers are about to become more abundant, then the weak link is the oil terminal infrastructure. Exert effort destroying the ports, and Russia cannot ship oil regardless of how many vessels would like to run the route. As a closing thought, again, we do not have any direct evidence that the United States and Ukraine are coordinating on these activities. The most that we can say is that the United States has assisted with the refinery portion of this campaign, and that the Trump administration has been remarkably quiet about what Ukraine has done with the Shadow Fleet. But sometimes the absence of a public position can inform Ukraine about how to continue, and the plan now seems to be to attack every last one of those vessels. Speaking of informing, thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take a fantastic 40% off a Vantage plan. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.